The sky over Dakota Territory held its breath. A low sheet of pewter pressed down on the land, muting color and sound alike. Snow had not fallen yet, but the wind already carried its warning dry, bitter, with a scent like rust and wood smoke. Along the edge of the prairie, the widow's cabin stood half sunk into the hillside, its roofline sagging like a weary shoulder, the door swinging just slightly open on a rusted hinge. Inside, it was colder than out. The fire had gone to coals, gray and dull, offering no more warmth than memory. Beside it, a child no older than 5 sat with a wool blanket tucked tight beneath her chin. She watched her brother with solemn, oversized eyes as he took the blade to a crust of bread so thin it bent beneath the pressure. He cut it in half, then in half again. 4 fingers of bread. 4 children. Their mother stood by the window, one hand on the sill, eyes fixed on nothing. Her dress hung off her frame like wet linen. She had not cried when the coffin was lowered last week, nor when the preacher stumbled through scripture with a voice thick from drink. She had not cried when the neighbors stopped coming. It was the way of the land, help in the hour of death, then silence. The widow knew that. But today, something in her looked hollowed out, some part of her finally caved in. The boy set the bread on the table. None of them moved to eat it. Their hands were too polite, too ashamed. The youngest girl coughed and tucked her chin to her chest. Outside, hooves broke the stillness. He rode slow, as if unsure of the trail, though the path to this place was clear as bone on the prairie. The horse was tall and chestnut-colored, thick-legged and wind-worn. The man in the saddle looked like the kind who'd spent more years under the sky than inside any roof. He wore no badge, just a duster faded by dust and rain, a felt hat low over his brow. When he dismounted, he didn't tie the reins. He didn't need to. The horse waited. He knocked once, and the sound barely registered. Then again, harder. The widow turned but didn't answer. She was too tired for strangers. The boy went to the door. When the cowboy stepped inside, he brought the cold with him. The children looked up, all eyes and bone. He glanced at the fire, then at the 4 slivers of bread untouched on the table. His jaw twitched. Then he looked at the widow. She did not flinch, but her spine straightened slightly, like a tree tested by wind. Her face held no welcome, just quiet readiness. "I passed Jim Carrow's place," he said, voice low, like gravel under boot. "Saw a cross in the ground. That him?" She nodded once. He looked again at the children, then down at the coals. "Ain't much left here." "No," she said. Her voice cracked, not from emotion, but from disuse. He didn't ask if she had kin. Didn't ask what she'd do now. The silence between them stretched, tight as wire. Then he stepped closer to the fire, reached into his coat, and pulled out a piece of jerky, breaking it in 2 and laying it on the hearth. The scent filled the room like warmth. He turned to the children, his gaze lingering on the smallest girl. "You all packed?" They looked confused. He turned to the widow. "Get your things. You're coming with me." The oldest boy's eyes went wide. The widow didn't move. "Ma'am," he said, not unkindly, "you got 4 little ones and no food. Snow's coming. This place'll bury you before the month is out." Her lips parted, but no words came, only a raw sound, something between refusal and collapse. "I ain't offering charity," he added. "I need help on the ranch. You need to keep them alive. Seems fair." Still, she hesitated. Pride was a strong thing in the West. So was fear. But stronger still was the look in her children's eyes when they turned to her, hopeful, uncertain, waiting. She moved then, slow and deliberate, crossing to the wall where a shawl hung like a memory. She wrapped it around her shoulders, then picked up a worn satchel from the floor and started filling it with what little remained: a comb, a book missing its cover, 2 shirts, 1 pair of boots with a hole in the toe. The cowboy did not help, but neither did he rush her. He watched her move, eyes quiet but sharp, as if he knew what it cost to leave something behind, even something empty. When they stepped outside, the wind met them with a long sigh. He helped the children onto the horse one by one. The oldest held the youngest in front. The middle 2 clung behind, sharing the warmth of a single coat. Then he turned to her. "You ride or walk?" "I walk." He gave a nod, then led the horse forward, slow enough for her to keep pace. Behind them, The cabin stood small and dark against the coming storm. Nothing stirred. No one called out. But ahead, the land opened wide cold. Yes, but waiting. The first night on the trail, they stopped beneath a bluff where the rocks broke some of the wind. He built a fire with practiced hands, each movement precise, as if the cold itself respected his rhythm. Sparks rose into the black, carried off like tiny prayers. The children huddled close, their faces lit orange in the flickering light. The widow sat a little apart, her knees drawn up, fingers locked tight around them. She hadn't spoken since they left. Her eyes, always searching the distance, had turned inward. She didn't ask where they were headed. Maybe she already knew. Or maybe it didn't matter. The cowboy didn't press her. He passed out strips of jerky and slices of dried apple, watching the children eat like they hadn't eaten in days, which was the truth. He poured water from a canteen into a dented tin cup and handed it to the boy first. "You got a name?" he asked. The boy wiped his mouth with his sleeve. "Eli." "You the oldest?" He nodded. 12. "All right, Eli. You'll help me tomorrow. Chores to do." Eli looked to his mother, uncertain. She gave the slightest nod. It was enough. The cowboy settled in after that, sitting cross-legged with his coat spread around him like a blanket. He pulled out a tobacco pouch but didn't smoke, just rolled it between his fingers, then tucked it away. "You got a name?" the widow asked, her voice cutting through the dark like a low whistle. He looked at her. "Colt." "Colt what?" He shrugged. "Ain't much use in the rest of it." She said nothing, just turned her gaze back to the fire. The wind stirred the flames sideways, and for a while there was only the sound of chewing, the low crackle of wood, and the groan of the cold pressing in. Colt added another log. The fire flared again, spitting sparks. "Tomorrow we cross Dry Creek," he said, not looking at anyone. "Got a bunkhouse. Stove works. Roof don't leak. It ain't much, but it'll keep you through the winter." The widow didn't respond. He continued anyway. "There's a corral. Chickens if the foxes haven't gotten them. One cow. Milk's decent if you're kind to her. I run cattle. Not many these days. Dust killed most of the grass south of the ridge. Got a few hands, but they come and go. You help in the kitchen. I'll feed you all." "You don't know us," she said. Not angry, just true. "I seen enough." A long pause followed. "What if I said no?" He looked up, slow. "Then I'd take you back. But I don't think you will." Colt added another log. The fire flared again, spitting sparks. "Because you didn't cry at the funeral, and you gave your last piece of bread to them before you touched it yourself. You're not the quitting kind." The words hung in the air, thick as smoke. She stared at him, lips parting as if to argue, then closing again. One of the girls coughed. Colt turned his eyes to the fire, poked it with a stick. "I ain't trying to save anyone, ma'am. I just don't believe in letting good folk rot alone if there's something better to be done." Eli leaned toward the flame, letting it warm his cracked hands. The other children curled beside him like pups, full and drowsy, soothed by the fire and the way Colt's voice had settled into the night without force or fear. The widow shifted closer, not by much, but enough. She unwrapped her shawl and stretched it wide, pulling the smallest girl in beneath it. Colt watched her from the corner of his eye, noted the way her hands shook when she thought no one was looking. "You got a name?" he asked gently. She hesitated. Then, "Miriam." He nodded once, then leaned back against the rock wall, one hand on the butt of his rifle, the other resting near the coals. "You can sleep," he said. "I'll keep watch." Miriam studied him for a long moment before her eyes dropped. She didn't thank him, but she didn't argue either. The stars above blinked sharp and cold through gaps in the cloud cover. Coyotes yipped somewhere far off. Lonely sounds carried on a restless wind. But the children slept, and Colt didn't move. Subscribe to walk further into the silence and the storms, where hearts are tested and found true. Morning came slow and mean, dragging a hard frost over everything. The world was colorless under a pale sky, the grass brittle as glass, the rocks rimed with white. Colt stirred the fire back to life with the heel of his boot, coaxing flames out of gray ash. Beside him, Eli was already awake, rubbing sleep from his eyes, his breath fogging in the cold. Colt handed him a scrap of burlap filled with kindling. "You ever chop wood?" Eli shook his head. "Then you'll learn. Axe handle short, blades dull. You'll need to mind your toes. Miriam woke to that, her body stiff from sleeping on hard ground, her neck sore. She pulled the shawl tighter and looked for her children. They were all still there, curled close, warm in sleep. She watched them longer than she meant to, before shifting her gaze to Colt and the boy Eli taking instruction without complaint. She had dreamed of her husband's hands last night, not his face, just the hands, weathered, calloused, stained with oil and dirt. They'd always looked older than the rest of him. She woke with the ache of them still pressing against her heart. Colt caught her watching. He didn't smile, just gave a nod that meant, "There's coffee, if you want it." She walked over, slow, joints cracking with cold. The metal tin was dented, blackened from fire. She took the cup without speaking, drank, and felt it burn down into her chest. The bitterness didn't bother her. It felt earned. They broke camp within the hour. Colt loaded the youngest onto the horse again and led it by hand. Miriam walked beside him this time. She didn't ask questions. Neither did he. It was nearly noon when the land changed. The trail crested a ridge, and there below, stretched wide like a waiting hand, lay the ranch. A rough-hewn fence ringed a patch of land spotted with snow, and beyond it, a two-room bunkhouse sat lopsided beside a barn, whose roof sagged on one side like it had taken a punch and never stood straight again. Chickens pecked in the dirt. A windmill turned slow, creaking with each pass. Smoke curled from the chimney, soft and white. The children perked up at the sight, their silence cracking with questions. Was that a cow? Were those chickens? Could they sleep inside tonight? Could they have milk? Colt answered what he could, brief and plain-spoken. Yes, yes, yes. Not much, but some. Inside the bunkhouse, the heat from the stove greeted them like a living thing. Miriam took one step in and stopped, overwhelmed not by comfort, but by the way her legs nearly gave out. Warmth was a betrayal after so much cold. Colt set down the bags. "This is yours now. You make of it what you can. Then you'll learn. Axe handle short, blades dull. You'll need to mind your toes. Where will you sleep?" she asked. She ran her hand along the edge of a small table. It was clean, not new, not fine, but clean. She looked at him then, really looked. His face was wind-worn, lined, the kind of tired that went deeper than rest could fix. But there was no greed in him, no kindness either, not the soft kind, just steadiness, like a post sunk deep into the ground. That night she cooked beans and cornbread. The smell filled the room, thick and warm. The children laughed for the first time in weeks. Colt sat on the porch, back against the wall, listening to the sound. After the children slept, Miriam stepped outside and found him still there, hat low, rifle resting across his knees. "You've done more than enough," she said quietly. He didn't answer right away, just looked out toward the ridge, where the wind moved the prairie grass in long whispering waves. "Not enough," he said at last, "but maybe just in time." She stood beside him a while. The night was clear, the stars sharp as glass. Somewhere out there, her husband's grave froze under a hard sky. But here, her children slept full-bellied and warm. "Barnes got a cot," he replied. "Better for me to be out there anyway." Colt didn't look at her, but he said, "You'll be all right here." Miriam nodded. "So will you." She didn't know what tomorrow would bring, but for the first time in a long while, she wasn't afraid of it. The days settled into a rhythm that asked much and gave little, but it was more than what came before. Mornings broke cold and slow, with frost clinging to the windows and the smell of ash and boiling coffee thick in the air. Miriam rose before the children, stoked the stove, and kneaded dough with hands that had once trembled but no longer did. She learned the land in pieces, how to carry water from the well without spilling, how to slap a chicken away from the feed barrel, how to gut a fish without thinking about it. Her hands grew coarse, her back sore, but she no longer flinched at pain. It was honest, at least. Colt kept his word. He stayed in the barn most nights, working the cattle, repairing fence posts, hunting stray coyotes that tested the perimeter. He came in only for meals and to teach Eli the work of a man. He showed the boy how to set a trap, sharpen a blade, swing an axe. He didn't praise, but he didn't scold either. His approval was silent, steady as a shadow, and Eli clung to it like rope in a flood. The girls took to Miriam's side. The oldest helped with laundry and kept the fire going, while the younger two learned to collect eggs, sweep the floor, fold cloth. Their laughter returned in bursts, small but alive. It filled the bunkhouse with something like music. But at night, when the wind howled and the stove flickered low, Miriam sat alone, fingers curled around a chipped mug, staring into the embers. She remembered the shape of her husband's voice, the sound of his boots coming through the door. She missed the weight of his arm, the low murmur of his prayers when he thought she was sleeping. And in the silence that followed, something passed between them, quiet, heavy, true. Not love, not yet, but something that might carry them both a little further down the trail. One afternoon, Colt brought back a broken wagon wheel and laid it by the barn. Could use a second hand. Miriam came out without a word and crouched beside him. He showed her where to brace it, how to fit the spoke just right. She didn't speak much, just listened. But as the hours passed and the work dragged on, he caught her humming low under her breath. A tune without words, something soft and worn from years. It stirred something in him, not desire, not quite. More like remembrance. "You sing often?" he asked, without looking up. "Used to. When the girls were small. They miss it." She smiled, a corner of her mouth lifting. "I suppose I do too." He looked at her then, really looked. Sweat at her brow, dirt on her cheeks, sleeves rolled past the elbow. She had lines around her eyes now, but they weren't from grief. They were earned. He nodded. "It suits you." She looked back at him, surprised, but didn't reply. That night, she did sing. Not loudly, not for show. Just enough that her children settled easier, that the night seemed less sharp. Spring came late that year, slow to melt the snow. But when it came all at once, water running wild down dry creek beds, grass pushing up in the pasture, calves born slick and loud in the mud. Life, messy and unrelenting, returned. With it came new problems. Supplies ran low. One of the hands rode off and didn't return. A neighbor came by offering money for the land, barely enough to insult. Colt turned him away with a look that said, "Not today, not ever." Later, he sat on the porch, jaw clenched tight, hat in his lap. Miriam brought him coffee, sat beside him. She didn't ask what troubled him. She didn't need to. Instead, she said, "You ever think about leaving this place?" "Thought about it," he said. "Plenty. But you stayed." He nodded once. She looked out across the land. "Me too." They sat like that a long time, neither speaking. There was no need. Inside, the children slept in a bed that hadn't known cold in weeks. Outside, the wind had calmed, the stars blinking lazy overhead. There was no future promised, but there was ground beneath their feet and warmth in their hands. And sometimes, that was enough. The storm came without warning. One day the sky was wide and clean. The next it darkened like bruised flesh and dropped a wall of snow across the prairie. The wind howled through the cracks in the bunkhouse walls, whistling like a scream from some far-off place. Colt had seen storms like it, but not in years, not this heavy, not this early. He boarded the windows with scrap wood and drove stakes into the chicken coop to keep the roof from blowing clean off. Miriam packed flour sacks around the doorframe to block the draft, kept the fire roaring even when the smoke made her eyes water. The children bundled together on the bed like pups in a den, listening to the wind scrape against the eaves. On the third night, the roof groaned loud enough to wake them all. Colt came inside with snow caked to his beard and shoulders, slammed the door behind him. "North wall of the barn's giving way," he said. "If the cows panic, we'll lose 'em." "I'll help," Miriam said. He shook his head. "Too cold. You can't do it alone." He stared at her for a second, longer than needed, then gave a tight nod. She pulled on Eli's boots. They were too big, but they'd do, and followed him into the storm. Snow bit at her face like sand, sharp and endless. The barn's lantern swung wildly from a nail, casting long, violent shadows. The cows were restless, eyes wide, hooves stamping. "You can't do it alone." Miriam moved among the animals, her voice low and steady, a song without melody, just rhythm and warmth. Her hands ran along their flanks, her body small between theirs, but fearless. Colt worked without pause, nailing boards, stuffing feed sacks into the cracks. Sweat froze to his back even as he moved. When it was done, when the wind stopped shaking the walls, and the animals stilled, he slumped beside her in the straw, chest heaving. "You're a damn fool," he muttered. She laughed, sharp and tired. "Takes one to know one." He looked at her then, and she at him. Neither moved. Snow creaked above them on the roof. Somewhere behind, a calf bleated in its sleep. Colt spoke first. "I ain't got much. No money to speak of. No neighbors close. Just land and quiet." Miriam nodded. "I've had less. I don't sleep much," he said, voice quieter now. "Never have. I get stuck in my head sometimes. Don't always talk when I should." She folded her arms, leaning back against the wall. "I don't always want talk. Sometimes quiet's enough." He turned his head toward her. The shadows softened the hard edges of his face. "You think this life's enough for you? For them?" She thought of her children's hands, no longer shaking from hunger, of their laughter during supper, their heads heavy on her shoulder at night. She thought of the grave back east, buried in a town that never gave them anything but dirt. "I think enough's not what I used to believe it was." They sat together in the hush that followed, the kind of silence not born of distance, but of understanding. The storm still raged, but it sounded farther away somehow. When they came back to the house, the children stirred in their sleep, sensing the change in the air. The bunkhouse was warm, filled with the scent of firewood and stew. Colt stood at the door, snow melting off his coat in thick drops. "I'll be back in the morning," he said. Miriam reached out and touched his arm. "You don't need to go." His eyes flicked to hers, unsure. She added softly, "Not tonight." He didn't answer, just stepped inside, closed the door behind him, and set his rifle down. Later, when the wind faded and the fire had dimmed to a glow, she lay beside him, not touching, not speaking, just close enough to feel the steadiness of his breath. It wasn't passion, it wasn't rescue, it was something stronger, something built. By the time spring softened the ground and coaxed green shoots through last year's dirt, something had changed, not loud or sudden, but certain as sunrise. Miriam no longer flinched when the wind rose. The children stopped asking if they would have to move again. And Colt looked less toward the horizon and more toward home, the days filled with labor. There was always something to fix, mend, or haul. Miriam took to the rhythm of ranch life with quiet tenacity. She carried water in both hands, split kindling with arms grown firm, and stitched torn shirts by lamplight. Her hands were calloused now, her back strong. She no longer looked like a woman waiting for rescue. She looked like someone who had rescued herself. Colt watched her with the cautious awe of a man who understood what it cost to come back from the edge. He didn't praise her with words. He showed it in the way he left her the last egg, or sharpened her kitchen knife without asking, or waited by the fence line to walk her in from the garden. One evening, as they sat on the porch with the children chasing fireflies in the yard, Eli asked, "You ever think about building something bigger?" Colt glanced at Miriam, then said, "You mean the house?" Eli nodded. "We all fit, but barely." Colt leaned back in his chair. "I've thought about it." Miriam looked at him sideways. "And what stopped you?" He took a slow drink of coffee. "Didn't have a reason before." The words hung there, plain and pointed. She felt them settle deep in her chest. A week later, Colt rode into town and returned with a wagon load of timber and hardware. He didn't announce his plans, just started digging post holes one morning. Eli joined him without being asked. The girls carried tools back and forth, proud to be useful. Miriam didn't speak on it until the second night, when he laid out the plans on the kitchen table. Crude pencil lines, not drawn to scale but full of intention. A room for each child. A wide porch, a wood-burning stove at the heart. Miriam looked at him sideways. "And what stopped you?" He met her eyes. "No." The work went slow. Spring was wet, and the creek swelled to the edges. They lost a morning helping a neighbor whose cattle had gotten stuck in the mud. Another to mending the corral fence after a wild sow tore through. But each time they came back to the house frame, they worked harder, longer. The bones of the new home rose beside the bunkhouse, tall and stubborn, like a promise. But even as the future took shape in pine and sweat, the past came knocking. It was a Sunday when the wagon rolled in dusty dark, with a long shadow cast from its driver. A man Miriam knew the moment she saw him. She stepped out into the yard, the sun hard in her eyes. her hands clenched at her sides. "Name's Silas Marks," the man said, eyes flicking from her to Colt, executor of Jim Carrow's estate. It was a Sunday when the wagon rolled in dusty dark, with a long shadow cast from its driver. A man Miriam knew the moment she saw him. She stepped out into the yard, the sun hard in her eyes, her hands clenched at her sides. He took a slow drink of coffee. Didn't have a reason before. Colt stepped forward, jaw tight. "She's not in that house anymore." Silas looked him over. "She's still his widow." "No," Miriam said, her voice steady. "I was. I'm not now." Silas raised his brows. "You plan to fight it?" She didn't flinch. "If I must." He studied her for a long moment. "Then I suppose we'll see." When he left, the children stayed inside, wide-eyed and silent. Colt stood in the doorway, hat in hand. "You don't owe anyone anything," he said. She looked past him, toward the posts rising from the earth. "I owe them a home." That night, they didn't sleep. They lay side by side, her head on his shoulder, his hand on her back, breathing in the dark like two people who had known too much silence to waste what was given. Outside, the wind blew soft. The stars blinked down on wood and soil, on walls yet to rise, on love not spoken but proven. And in the dark, Miriam whispered, "We'll finish it, no matter what comes." Colt answered without opening his eyes. Together. The letters came first, each one colder than the last. Paper sealed with city ink, bearing words like foreclosure, lien, and restitution. Miriam read them in the early morning when the children still slept, her hand steady but her breath shallow. She did not cry. She did not tear them up. She folded each one neat and laid it in the drawer beside the Bible. Colt said little about them. He read the lines over her shoulder, jaw tightening, eyes darkening, but he didn't rage. He simply went back to work. That summer, they hauled stone from the dry creek bed to fortify the house's foundation. Colt dug trenches with his shirt soaked through, Miriam alongside him with a spade in hand and sweat running down her spine. The children gathered nails and mixed mud, their laughter flaring between chores. And in the evenings, they sat together on the porch of the old bunkhouse, watching the frame of their future stretch taller against the sky. But the weight of Silas Marks's threats lingered like dust in the corners. He returned in person come August, dressed too fine for a man whose business thrived on grief. This time he brought a lawyer from Cheyenne, a man with slicked hair and a folder full of signatures. "This land was claimed under Jim Carrow's name," the lawyer said, "which passed to his estate, not his wife." "She was his wife," Colt said, stepping between them and the porch where the children listened. "And she's lived and worked this land, raised it back up." "Sentiment doesn't erase ink," Silas added, smug. "She can leave quiet, or we make it legal." Miriam stepped forward then. She looked tired, not worn out, not beaten, just done with pretending. "I cooked every meal that man ate. I bore every child with my own body. I buried him with my own hands. This land was not his. It was never just his. I paid for it, day after day." The lawyer opened his mouth, but Colt raised a hand. "I bought lumber," he said, "tools. I fed this family. No claims against me." The lawyer hesitated. Silas scoffed. "You're not married. You've no standing." The word hung there. Not married. Miriam blinked slowly. The air seemed to pause with her. Then she looked at Colt. He didn't smile. He didn't falter. He just nodded. Once. Like the truth had already settled in him. "Then we fix that," he said. And just like that, something deep shifted. The lawyer looked startled. Silas took a step back. "You think a wedding stops law?" Silas barked. "It stops you," Colt said, voice low and sure. "It stops you from thinking she's alone." The next morning, before dawn, Miriam stood in a faded blue dress, her hair plaited down her back. The preacher from Pine Bluff rode out and met them by the edge of the new house, between two rough cedar beams not yet nailed into place. Eli stood beside her with the girls clinging to his sides, their eyes wide and solemn. The ceremony was short. Colt said the words like they were stones he'd been holding in his mouth for years. Miriam said them softer, but not less certain. When it was done, they kissed awkwardly, briefly, but it wasn't for show. It was acknowledgement. A vow not just spoken but lived. They built faster after that, as if something sacred pressed them forward. When Silas returned, he brought more papers. but Colt brought 3 neighbors. 2 of them war veterans who'd settled west and owed him more than a few favors. They testified to Miriam's labor, her work, her land. The case didn't go to court. Silas left that day without saying a word, and when the door shut behind him, Miriam sat down at the new table Colt had built with his own hands. The sun poured through the unfinished windows, lighting the dust like gold. She reached across the table, took Colt's hand, and held it for a long, still moment. Outside, the land breathed easy again. The wind turned soft. The porch creaked under children's feet. Inside, love settled not as fire, not as thunder, but as shelter. The house was finished before the first frost, walls sealed tight, chimney drawing smoke like breath from a warm body. The bunkhouse stood empty now, its door creaking in the wind, a ghost of their old life. The children had rooms of their own, small but theirs, windows facing east to catch the morning sun. Colt built the porch wide and low. With a swing he hung himself, testing its weight with his own. He planted 2 trees near the steps, cottonwoods, thin and uncertain, but growing. They moved in on a Sunday. Miriam carried the kettle over first, setting it on the new stove like a promise. The girls followed, arms full of quilts and dolls. Eli brought his father's old rifle, the one that had never fired right but still meant something. Colt came last, holding the family Bible beneath one arm. No one spoke much that day. But when the door closed behind them and the wind rattled the glass, they were home. Winter was early and harsh, but it didn't reach them the way it used to. They'd put up enough wood, filled the root cellar, brined the meat. Colt shot a buck late in the season, and Miriam worked by lantern to dress it, her hands sure now, her face calm. In January, the youngest girl, Sarah, fell sick. Fever, red cheeks, ragged breath. Miriam didn't panic. She stayed beside the bed for 2 nights straight, wiping sweat from Sarah's brow, feeding her broth by the spoonful. Colt rode through snow to fetch herbs from an old widow 2 miles west. Sarah got better. By spring, the land around the house had changed. Colt built a new fence farther out, claiming more ground. The chickens nested fat with eggs. Miriam began to keep a journal in the evenings, scribbling in a half-filled ledger by the stove, her handwriting slow but steady. One evening in April, she sat on the porch as the sun dipped low. The land before her rolled out like a worn quilt, patched and hard-used, but still warm. Colt sat beside her, boots kicked up, whittling a piece of cedar. The scent curled in the air between them, clean and sharp. She turned her face toward him. "You ever think we'd come to this?" He shook his head. "Didn't think I'd make it this far." She nodded. "Me neither." He laid the carved piece of wood in her hand. It was rough, a bird, maybe, or a horse, but shaped with care. She turned it over slowly. "Thank you," she said quiet. She turned her face toward him. "You ever think we'd come to this?" But they both knew it was. He shook his head. "Didn't think I'd make it this far." He didn't look at her. "Ain't nothing. I was scared," she whispered. "So was I," he said. She nodded again. "But you stayed." "I had reason." Their hands found each other. No ceremony, no sudden heat. Just a hand in a hand, fingers interlocked, the way roots grow underground, slow, invisible, steady. Inside, the table was set. A stew simmered. The Bible lay open on the shelf. Outside, the light dimmed and the wind carried the sound of a future being lived. There would still be hard days. Storms would come. Fences would break. The world would not grow kind just because they had. But they had each other now, not as rescue, not as replacement, but as choice, as family, as home. The story does not end here. Subscribe and continue with us to what lies beyond.